There you go.
Okay. So thank you all for having me. I definitely appreciate it. Always love to speak on topics, especially around security right now. And this wasn't really a fun session to put together, so I'm glad to have more opportunities to give it. My name is Leighton-Dick, and I'm president and principal architect for Kingfisher Technologies, which is a SQL Server consulting firm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Really, my focus is a lot on data protection, of which cybersecurity is a big part. It takes a lot of different flavors, but that's definitely one thing that's near and dear to my heart. I've been working with cybersecurity for quite some time, and it's great to be able to incorporate that into the data world, which is something else that's I'm a huge fan of. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for the data platform. I am regional mentor for this area, as Dan mentioned, and I have previously led the user group up here in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City for about 10 years and ran the SQL Saturday as well. Turned those over to other people this year, but I'm still very active in the groups up here and always happy to do what I can for the community. If you have any questions after the session, definitely feel free to get a hold of me. My contact information is up here on the slide as far as social media, but my email address is going to be on the last slide in the deck as well. So any of those is a fine way to get a hold of me. I forgot to take that slide out. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is how you can take some of the security information you can gather from SQL Server itself. We're not talking about third-party tools here, although you can definitely do that. But take that security information that you can surface within SQL Server from various sources and pull that together and then create a useful dashboard using Power BI to really make it very quick and easy to get a bird's eye view of what's going on in your SQL Server environment with regards to security. This is something that a lot of us haven't done to date. Security tools tend to be very complex. We tend to have a lot of them, but it's becoming more and more important to be able to stay on top of security as it becomes a more and more critical topic nowadays. So was definitely an interesting exercise to start building this, and it's going to be great to have it going forward. So we all know that security has become critical, right? I don't think anybody would disagree with that anymore. Enterprises particularly have a very large concern with this. And it's really permeated every level of what we do, or it should permeate every level of what we do going forward. Not only is it required by numerous regulations anymore, everything from HIPAA, for those of you who are in the medical field, that HIPAA came about almost 20 years ago now, if maybe not, maybe even a little bit more. Sarbanes-Oxley requires cybersecurity. If you're looking at something like a SOC certification or some of the ISO certifications, many of those require some sort of cybersecurity component to it. Increasingly, you see contractual regulations or requirements to improve cybersecurity in your enterprise. If you take credit cards, you have to comply with PCI, which is the credit card industry standard. Many, many different ways that security enters the consciousness of the enterprise. Even if you're not required to do it, though, it's still a great idea, just because there are so many data breaches now. And every state has some sort of a data breach notification law. You also want to stay on top of it for the GDPR. If you do do businesses with anybody that's a European citizen. If you do business with anybody in California, you're currently affected by the CCPA, or the California Consumer Protection Act. That is going to be morphing within the next 18 months into the CPRA, which is even more strict in some ways than the CCPA. If you do business with people in New York, they have a recently beefed up data protection law. And this is only going to continue to become more prevalent. Most jurisdictions are considering some sort of increased data privacy or data protection act. And that's worldwide. In many cases, these new regulations or these new laws are defined such that they protect the people in their jurisdiction, regardless of where the business that actually is the subject of the regulation resides. So it doesn't matter if you don't have a physical location in Europe. If you do business with somebody who is in Europe, then you're affected by the GDPR. California's statute is the same. New York statute is the same. It doesn't matter where you are. It only matters where your customer is. And that, I think, is going to be that kind of the baseline going forward. All of this security requires that you're going to be audited much more frequently. They're going to be asking you these questions. And it looks really good for you if you already have answers. If you can already say, yes, I'm looking at that on a regular basis. Whether it's something that fits in your dashboard or not is a different story, but these are things that you should be looking at on a regular basis. But it's frankly difficult to keep track. There are really no good security tools for SQL Server that I know of. At least if there are any, they're very few and they're not well known. Certain tools will surface certain pieces of information, but in general, there's not a lot out there. And for those tools that are out there, as far as security tools, most large organizations have a plethora of them, to say the least. This recent statistic is that many organizations have well over 50 different tools just for cybersecurity that they're trying to keep track of on a regular basis. And that becomes a very impossible task to try and keep track of that much, let alone adding specialized tools for things like your database servers. So this falls to the DBA to come up with a way to be able to keep track of what is happening on their servers. The next problem with all of this is that all of these tools, these 50, 60, 70 tools that many organizations have, all spit out a ton of data. Many of us are already subjected to what I call alert spam all day long, in which you just see alert after alert after alert in whatever medium your company uses, whether it's Slack, whether it's Teams, whether it's email, whether it's some sort of a ticketing system. You're constantly getting pinged by these. Many alerting tools do not do much of anything for you to be able to only surface the most important pieces of information. So you end up with this massive raw unfiltered data, too many alerts, a lot of tools. There's just constant barrage of noise that you have to deal with. So what do? You need to find a way to simplify and focus and decide for yourself what is the important things that need to break through, that you need to be paying attention to on a regular basis to be able to get something useful out of all of this. And that's where the dashboard comes in. So the first thing that you want to do when you are looking at building a dashboard, and this applies not only for security, you can also surface various metrics that are critical for the performance or for the reliability of your servers. You can even include those in the same dashboard. That's one nice thing about this approach, as opposed to a box tool that you might go out and buy, is you can make this exactly what you want. So the first thing to do is identify what it is that you need to know. And you have to narrow this down. Otherwise, you're going to end up with the same old problem where you have way too much data and not enough information coming out of the tool. So what's the most critical information that you can get? What will help you spot a problem? In the case of performance, this might be like a misconfigured network adapter. What would tell you that you have a network problem where you've got a ton of network latency? What will help you spot a trend? For security, that might be the number of failed logins that you get. How does that compare to your baseline? If it's way, way up at a specific time, either you have an application that's having a problem, or you have somebody that's attempting to breach your network. So look for those things that you know from past experience will help you spot those problems or trends that may be invading your subconscious and keeping you up at night. And then what are you being asked? What are your auditors asking? What are your managers asking? What is your board asking? What are your colleagues asking? What are these questions that people want to know? Get a list of all of these things and then narrow it down. You want to get it down to like a list to start with anyway. You want to get it down to a list of like 5 or 6 things that you feel are the most critical pieces of information. This is a starting point. Your number may be fewer, it may be more, but start by aiming for something like 5 or 6, just to have something that's a manageable size to get started with. And as I said before, these do not strictly have to be limited to security, so to speak. There's a lot of things that you can put on here that may indicate to you that there's a problem that needs to be addressed, that are not in the dictionary definition of security. So some of these that I pulled out for the demo here. New and changed logins. This can refer to a new login that somebody is creating as part of a hack attempt, but it also just is a good thing for you to keep track of, especially if you have a different group that is responsible for creating the logins on the servers. In a large enterprise, that's not unusual anymore. You offload that off of the DBA onto a central security team or a help desk that has specific procedures that they have to follow in order to create those. It's good for you, even if you're not, especially if you're not the one creating them, to be able to have that visible to you so that you know who has access to your server. Privilege role changes. This applies to something like sysadmin, maybe a DB owner, security admin. There's a few other roles that I consider to be privileged roles. So who is being added to or subtracted from those privileged roles? Is this something you expect? If not, that's something that you need to react to one way or another. Connection statistics. This will help you understand your baseline, to know how many people are connecting, what times of the day, and then you can understand from the deviances from the baseline whether you've got some sort of a problem that needs to be addressed, whether it's security related or otherwise. But that, if you suddenly start to see a big spike in connections, that definitely can be an indication of a security breach. Orphaned Windows logins is an interesting one, and it's one that I like to check when I'm working with a SQL Server, because what happens is that, for those that don't know, is that when you create a Windows user on the SQL Server, it is tied directly to the Windows login in Active Directory or on your local machine. However, if somebody, it's entirely possible and happens frequently that the person or that somebody will delete that Windows login from Windows or the Active Directory without telling the DBA, because they don't know or they don't realize that it doesn't clean itself up. And leaving those out there can be a vulnerability when it comes to a breach. And so you want to clean those up, just if for no other reason, just to keep in the environment, but also because it can reduce your attack surface. Last reboot is another one I like to keep track of, partially because of system problems. I've had a number of servers over the years that I've been working with SQL Server that develop some sort of a problem and will spontaneously reboot. Whether that's because of a crash or whether it's because some administrator patched the server and didn't tell me they were going to do that. in which case that's a talking point that needs to be addressed. There could be other reasons that the server might be rebooted, but one big one when it comes to security is that if one of the commonly known methods of adding administrator credentials or gaining administrator access to a SQL server is to use a Windows administrator account on the SQL server and take SQL Server into single user mode. That requires a reboot of SQL Server. And so by tracking that, you won't be surprised, or at least you'll know about it when that server reboots. And that's a critical piece of information to have. And then the other one that I like to include in things like this is certificate stats. If you're doing any sort of encryption, you really need to pay attention to the expiration dates of the certificates that you're using. Many people have pointed out to me over the years that you can still encrypt data even after the certificate has expired. And that's true. That's absolutely true. Microsoft doesn't want to lock you out of your data. However, there's other operations that you won't be able to perform if that certificate is expired. And just in general, it's a good idea to keep those certificates rotated anyway. The other thing to track with regards to certificates is the last time that the private key was backed up. With a certificate, you have a public key and a private key. This is in common between both the web-based certificates like you use for SSL, as well as the certificates we use for SQL Server. I've seen a number of cases where nobody ever backs up the certificates, or they back it up, they don't remember where they put it, or they'll back up the public key, which is the obvious piece, but they don't back up the private key. The private key is the part that actually allows you to decrypt the data. And so it's absolutely critical that you don't lose that. The best way to do that is to have that part of a regular backup cycle, just like the rest of your data. Doesn't necessarily have to be as frequent, but you want to make sure that you're backing that up on some sort of a schedule and you know where that is. And so that tracking that is one good way to do that. And by all means, these are not the only things to track. These are just like a half dozen that for me are critical ones that make for a good starting point. There's a lot of different sources of this type of data built directly into SQL Server. Some of the most common ones: catalog views and dynamic management objects. Those have a ton of different data. Some of this, like certificates, are built into catalog views. Others, like the connection information, may be built maybe in dynamic management objects. And it just depends on the type of data and how often it changes. SQL Server error logs are available. There's a decent amount of information in there that is not logged anywhere else, at least not in the same form. And so that can be a good way to get it, but you have to do a little bit more parsing in that than you might otherwise from some other sources. Default trace and system health, those are both turned on in SQL Server by default. If they're not on your instances, you want to turn them on, because if you ever have a problem and have to call into Microsoft, that's one of the first things they're going to ask you for is the default trace and system health. Or they're going to ask you to run some of their tools which rely on default trace and system health. You can also use these two traces in order for your own purposes, and there is a decent amount of security information or useful information in both. SQL Server Audit, I did a whole presentation on SQL Server Audit last year at Summit, and that's actually one of the ones that Daniel mentioned earlier that is available through Pass Pro. And that's a great tool to capture some information on the fly in a secure manner, and especially if you are having to track what is done with like a sysadmin level account, SQL Audit is one of the best ways to do that, because you can prevent the administrators from disabling the audit sessions silently, which auditors love. They like to see things like that. And then you can also create custom extended events and custom traces. And many of us already know how to do that, so I won't go into that at all. But That can be for certain types of events or certain types of data. That can be a great way to capture that as well. There's a number of ways to collect it. SQL Server Audit obviously is one of those. Many times the simplest solution is the best, and so a SQL agent job will do the job nicely. And with SQL agent, you can use either scripts in T-SQL, you can use PowerShell scripts, you can use SSIS to gather data. The important thing with the jobs is you want to make sure that you keep them as small and lightweight and targeted as possible, because with all of this, and this goes for event notifications or traces or extended events or audits or whatever, you want to make sure your primary goal should be, aside from gathering the information, is to not affect production. You want to make sure that these are as lightweight as possible so that your impact on the system is as minimal as possible. Event notifications I mentioned, extended events I mentioned, I talked about that. Event notifications are cool in that they use the service broker architecture and are asynchronous, and so that further reduces the impact that they have on the system. I'll show you more about that in just a moment. And then what I like to do is I like to put a collection database on each server. And this just, again, goes toward minimizing that impact, because if you go cross-server, you introduce that latency into it. And especially if you're doing something that, for example, a trigger that is actually a part of the transaction, you want to make sure that you are getting out of that transaction, that user transaction, as quickly as possible to avoid interrupting it. And so put that collection database on each server, and then you can shuttle the information from there to someplace that's better to report it from. So let's see how that works. Got on the wrong screen. Okay. Blow it up a little bit. Okay. So all of these scripts are available out of my GitHub repository, and I'll make sure you guys have the link to that at the end of the session. But feel free to take these and see what you can gather out of them for your own purposes. So there is a reset script which will create the basic objects. There's two scripts here which will create the databases that this demo uses. I also create AdventureWorks for this, and you can just download that from Microsoft's repositories. They have both a script created as well as actual backup files. So there's nothing surprising in here, but just go through this. I use a number of different pieces in this, including Service Broker, including transparent data encryption. There's a few other techniques in here that you might be interested in that we'll talk about as we go through. But I did that partially just to demonstrate some of these for people that don't know, because there's a lot of power in some of the features that people know less about. So those scripts are definitely available. But getting into the interesting part, the unique part, just showing you how all of these are put together. I've got three scripts which actually go toward creating collecting the data from your local server. First, they all create some procedures to be able to capture this information. The first one here is to capture the orphaned logins that I talked about. There is a SQL Server stored procedure called SP-validate logins, which is designed for this purpose. It's a very, very simplistic procedure. All it does is it looks at the list of usernames for Windows connected server principals, Windows connected logins, whether it be an individual or a group login, that are defined in your SQL Server, and it goes out and bounces those off of the Active Directory. and just looks to see if that login exists. It doesn't matter if that login is disabled or not in Windows. It doesn't try to decipher who might be in that group or anything like that. It just is looking to see if you have a user ed in your Active Directory in your SQL Server, that user ed still exists in Windows. If not, it returns that as part of its output. And I'm using merge here to get it into my table. The next one is to capture the last reboot. And there's multiple ways documented to be able to capture the last reboot time. This is one of them that I like to use on newer versions of SQL Server, and that is DMS OS sysinfo. That contains a column called SQL Server start time. That is the time that SQL Server last restarted at, in other words, at the end of the reboot. Really, it's not practical to be able to grab the time that the reboot started, but there's a number of different ways to do it when it finishes, including a job that runs on restart, including a system startup procedure. There's different ways that you can go about getting this. They'll all return slightly different times because they run at different parts in the reboot cycle. But for our purposes, when we're running to the last date, it's all close enough. So this just grabs that out of DMS sysinfo on reboot through a job. For certificates, I'm doing a very simple just query from the certificate, sys.certificates view. All of the information I want for this demo is in there. There are other catalog views that contain certificate information. You may need to join some of them together to get it, but for the most part, sys.certificates is your friend for pulling this type of information. Very straightforward, very quick and easy. And then for these, I'm just creating basic jobs. For part of this, I'm capturing it every 5 minutes. For part of this information, I'm capturing it on reboot. For part of it, I'm capturing it like once a day. It just depends on the type of data that you have. Okay, so the second piece of this is event notifications. I'm doing event notifications here to demonstrate how you would go about pulling something like login changes that is tracked via event notifications or that can be activated that way. Part of this is just plumbing for Service Broker because event notifications do run on top of Service Broker. But the most important piece of information here is the event notification itself. So create event notification on server. You can also say on database for certain types of events, depending on which level it runs at. For, in this case, create login, alter login, and drop login. And then I want to send that to the Service Broker service. I've got another one for the role changes. And it's set up the exact same way for the add server role member event. In both cases, this is going to grab the event off of the stack, doesn't interrupt your process, and then it's going to put it into a Service Broker queue for you to handle however you want. Sometimes you can generate an alert that way, so have that procedure that's activated by Service Broker send off an email. In this case, though, I want to grab that information and put it into a table. So down here, I am shredding that XML that comes out of the event notification and dropping it into my table. Quick and easy. One thing I want to emphasize is if you're using Service Broker, make sure that you're using save points and that you're using good error handling, preferably with something like begin try, to be able to trap any errors and prevent them from blowing up the transaction that causes the event to happen in the first place. Okay, so we've got a couple of procedures to handle the events that come in and then activating the queues. And then the final piece here is SQL audit. So this walks you through the process of creating a SQL audit as well. There's a couple of different pieces. One is creating the audit itself. The audit itself defines the storage for everything that comes out of the audit. So in this case, I'm going to throw it to this file. I'm going to define some rollover files. I'm going to give it my failure action, and I've given it a very brief filter because I don't care about when service accounts connect. I expect those to happen, and those are almost impossible to compromise. So I'm going to filter that out, just not even capture that. Then you create a server audit specification to define what you want it to collect. In this case, I've got the audit tracking successful logins and failed logins. Simple as that. Okay, and then I turn it on. And then I created a procedure here for capturing that audit information and bringing the audit captures it into a data file. I need to bring that information back from the data file into my SQL Server table. So I'm pulling that information back out of the audit file using fn-get audit file. And then this last file and last offset is interesting. With audit, there's no way to search the file. The only thing you can do basically is store the last point from which you grabbed information. And then you can pass that into fn-get audit file until this is the place I want to start the next time, and it will read through the file until it finds the records that have that pointer. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm passing in the last point at which I read information so that it can pick up where it left off the next time it runs through my file. And that just reduces the impact on the server a little bit more. Okay. Oh, by the way, I should say, feel free, if you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to jump off mute and interrupt or throw something in the chat. I've got that up on my screen also, so where I can see it. So if you have anything, just feel free to jump in. Okay. Speaking of questions, do we have any questions right now? Okay. So all of this is back-end work to be able to populate these 6 tables here in my database. 5 of them for the instance level information, and then 1 for the orphan logins. Okay, and all of this is happening in an automated fashion as I go through all of my servers, or as I'll go through all these demos. It's actually running constantly right now. Go back to the deck for a few minutes. Okay, so after you collect all of your data, this is going on constantly behind the scenes. You have all of this data. Now you need to make some use of it. And what you want to do is be able to spot trends across servers. If you keep it in those databases that are on each individual server, it becomes very, very difficult to spot trends across servers, such as a specific login that's being created on every server in your environment suddenly, when you didn't expect it, or a huge connection spike, or different IP addresses than you'd expect, or whatever. There's a lot of things you could grasp by looking across servers that are almost impossible to see looking at each server individually, like a lot of DBAs do with SQL Server, just because of the way Management Studio works. So we want to centralize all that information, pull it into one place so that we can get that single pane of glass experience. Another side benefit is that this reduces the resource load of the dashboard. We're getting it off of the production servers where we're doing all of the work anyway, and putting it onto another server that's more isolated, so that we don't have the impact of the analysis. Grab the data as quickly as you can on the local servers, throw it into that table. Don't worry too much about filtering it at that point. Filter it once you get over to that central server where you don't have to worry so much about the load. There's a number of different places that you can put this central database. If you have kind of a lot of shops, especially larger ones, have a server that the DBAs use for their own production processes, like maybe it runs backups or maybe monitoring SQL Sentry or Redgate or whatever. That can be a good place to put something like this. You may be lucky enough to be able to create an instance for yourself that nobody else can get into for any reason. That's even better when you're talking about security information. You could also create something out in Azure. When you're talking about Azure, though, really for the way I created this demo, there are certain features which I included that just don't work. They're not features of Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance, and so that would push me toward the VM, SQL Server and a VM on Azure. But depending on what features you use, you may need to use one platform or the other. Just know what features that you want, and then figure out which platform will work. Once you get that data over into your central repository, and again, just like gathering the data, you don't want to filter as you're going into that repository. Wait until it's already landed. This is definitely more of an, if you're familiar with data warehousing, this is much more of an ELT model than an ETL model. ELT is extract, load, and transform, where you're doing the transformation after it's already been loaded into this central repository, and that keeps the load isolated. Summarization, pre-summarizing the columns that you actually, or the pieces of data that you actually want to get out of it, saves resources later, and just as importantly, it allows for very consistent views of the data. Rather than having code which can drift on each of the individual servers, you're getting that summarization off into a central location, and there's only one copy of it. So, you want to come up with some key metrics, and everybody's going to have different definitions of exactly what they mean by key metrics. But for me, I want to distill the data into simple numbers. On a dashboard, you want this to be very visual. And you'll see what I mean by this in a little bit better in just a moment, but you don't want to have big blocks of text or big tables of data, because that takes time to parse through. You can have your dashboard link off to that, but for the dashboard itself, keep the data to simple numbers, things that can be graphed, or a single number, a single KPI. Something that's a count, a percentage, a summation, a difference, a deviation, whatever. The numbers need to be easy to understand. So don't do anything that requires a lot of calculations. Do all that calculation ahead of time. Make the numbers very easy to understand. Make them easy to understand correctly. So take some time to think about how you need to present this information to make it understandable to whoever is looking at this, whether it's you or somebody else. And have the numbers tell a story in one form or another. Keep it objective, but at the same time, have it tell a story. Don't just have it be a raw dump of numbers. Have it describing something, whether it's the number of connections that we're getting and how that's different from the norm, whether that is how long it has been since the last reboot, whether it's the number of new logins that are created on which servers, or whatever. Have it tell some sort of a story. And as I mentioned before, limit yourself. There's any number of different ways you can get the data there. You're certainly welcome to use something like linked servers if you want to. If that's what you have, great, use it. What I'm using for this demo and what I like to use for something like this is Service Broker, actually. It's a tool that has been around for a number of years now. And when it first came out, there was a lot of people that really didn't like it. It was not documented well. It definitely had its bugs. It was very much a traditional Microsoft V1 product when it first came out in SQL 2005. And it was very, very different. It got a bad name right off the bat. But Microsoft fixed it. It has improved it, and it's now baked into a lot of the things that, a lot of the biggest features in SQL Server, and you don't even know it. It's very reliable. It has very, very low overhead in most cases. It's just a great tool to be able to move data around in a very flexible manner. And as I said, it's all asynchronous, so it limits the ability of this type of work to interrupt the production workload. I highly encourage encryption for anything like this, because you're talking about security data. This is stuff that most people shouldn't see. So take advantage of the security features you have. Transparent data encryption, definitely. It's easy, it's available everywhere now. Thankfully, they finally released it to standard edition for SQL 2019. Use Always Encrypted if you can. It's a great tool, I really like it, but it depends on what you're using it for. If you're using Power BI on the web, Always Encrypted isn't an option. It doesn't support it yet. But you could always use something like in-column encryption as a potential source of data. So there's different ways you can do it. Use SSL to secure those data pathways. Use Azure Key Vault to secure your secrets, like passwords and such, or encryption keys. And then even like dynamic data masking. It's another feature that's derided sometimes because, yeah, it's not 100% secure. There's ways to get around it, but for what you're doing here, it's simple and effective from the perspective of the dashboard. If you actually do want to put any privileged information on the dashboard, mask it. Just make it easy to just get that information out there in a secure manner. Okay. So we'll go back to the demo for a minute. And what I want to show you on this demo is really how we're getting it there. Now in this case, because it's a demo environment, I only have the one server. Most of the time you're going to want to use more than one server. You're going to want to get this, again, away from that production workload. To create the workload in this case, I ran a whole bunch of scripts against AdventureWorks. There's a great little workload generator for AdventureWorks that Jonathan Cahias created a number of years ago. And it's been upgraded by a couple different people over the years, but it still works really, really well. So I ran that workload, collected the information in my security collector database like we showed just a minute ago, and then I'm collecting everything into the security dashboard. And as I said, I'm using Service Broker to do that. So in this script, you're going to see all of the various plumbing that you have to put in for Service Broker, and it's not all that hard. You will need to create an endpoint if you're using multiple servers. I'm not in this case, but you would have to if you're going cross-server. You create message types. I'm using a message type for each one of the different types of data that I'm capturing so that I can easily distinguish them and throw them off to different destinations. You create a contract to be able to wire everything together. And then you create a queue and a service on top of that, to wire everything, all of these various pieces together. And then the final piece is a route to tell it how to find the receiving service. In this case, it's on the local machine, but this could just as easily be a DNS name or an IP address with a port in either case to tell it where to find the ultimate destination where this data is supposed to go to. I do that twice, once for the source database and once for the target database. So I've got my two databases, so there's two sets here. And there's a couple other comments in here about how to do things when you're going cross-server. But one thing that's really important is when you're using multiple servers, just like you're going to use SSL, make sure you're using dialog security for Service Broker. And that simply encrypts each packet as it goes across the wire so that you're not sending anything in plain text. It's just a good idea for cross-server communication. So there's a number of procedures in here. I have, and these are a little bit out of order as far as you'd logically think about it, but it makes sense as far as the way SQL Server needs to put things together. So one of the send to dashboard is the piece that actually takes care of sending the information from the trigger that captures it as it goes into security collector. I'm using triggers, and we'll see those in a moment. But as a row is inserted into the security collector database, I have a trigger that's firing to shuttle that information off through Service Broker into the queue to be transmitted over to the other server and its queue, and then to be read and then shredded and put into the actual destination table on the receiving database. And that's what these do. It opens the conversation and it sends the information from the trigger into the handle, which represents the remote location using the message type for that piece of information. And so there's one procedure like that for each type of information. This is the procedure to be able to actually take that information and put it into the table. So again, there's one for each one. It takes in the XML data from Service Broker. So those are fairly simple. Also, it's just inserting the data. 6 of those. And then this is the Service Broker activation procedure received from collector on the destination database. And the format's going to follow very much like what we had with event notifications. It's going to use the specialized receive command to grab one off of the Service Broker queue. And it's going to decide based on that message type what to do with it. It's going to run one of those 6 procedures. Or it's going to throw an error message, then it's going to send the acknowledgement back so that the initial queue, if it needs to, could do some post-processing on its side if you wanted it to. And then finally in this we have the triggers to actually create the data. So this is using the inserted table. Some of these are using a cursor, done in the safe way, of course. But a cursor to go through the rows in the inserted table, because when you use a trigger and it has, the trigger is feeding off of something in which the insert statement or the update or the delete affected multiple rows, you've got to somehow break those into individual rows to send it into Service Broker. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm using the cursor to just loop through those and send those one at a time into an XML blob into Service Broker. And there's different ways you could do it, but a cursor is very simple and effective in this case, as long as you constrain it. Okay, so that really runs through how I put these different pieces together. You've got the trigger coming off of those initial tables where we dropped them on the local database, throwing them into Service Broker to be transmitted across the wire asynchronously into the receiving tables in the dashboard. And then from there, that's the collecting phase. And then the summarization phase, for this I'm using views, believe it or not. that for what I was doing for this demo was a very simple and effective way to be able to quickly summarize just down to what I wanted to be able to display on my dashboard. So I didn't have to read any more data for that than necessary. So you'll, as you go through these scripts, you'll, I'll leave this as an exercise for you to go through and to figure out exactly what I'm doing, because it's all just standard T-SQL. But I'm getting it down to that metric. So for the last reboot, even though I'm gathering more data than this, the only thing I really care about is the last reboot time. When did I last reboot this? And you'll notice as you go through the scripts that I converted everything into UTC, and that's just to get rid of any bias for time zone changes. When was the last time this server rebooted? So for logins orphaned, I'm actually summarizing down to a few data points. How many happened in the last 1 day? How many were first discovered in the last 7 days, the last 30 days, so on. Same with the certificate expirations, although these are the next 1, 7, and 30 days. So which ones are coming up? For some of these, I'm doing them a little bit different way in that I'm just returning a whole big set of data. So like connections by IP address is one. And for that, I'm looking for how many connections were attempted, what's the IP address, how many succeeded, and what was the hour, so I can graph it over time. So take a look at those. Again, very, very simple, but we want to get it down to those very simple metrics that we can easily graph and digest very quickly. Okay, any questions so far? All right. You guys are a quiet group today. Okay, so now that we've got all that data into that central database, we've summarized it so that it is easy to digest for the dashboard itself. Now we want to create that dashboard. And so that step gets down to how do we display this effectively? You want this to be as quick to view and understand as possible. So again, don't put tables full of data in there. Don't put lots of raw numbers. Get this down to those key pieces of information. Simplify it as much as you can while still telling the story that you're trying to tell, whatever that story is. Keep it visual. Humans are visual creatures. We can actually interpret the meaning of a chart many, many, many times faster than we can interpret a set of raw data. That's just the way that we're hardwired by evolution. And so keep it visual. Let people understand the data, at least at that high level, through the image that you're displaying. Use color. Use the different types of graphs that are available to you, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. Learn about some of these different types of visualizations and ways to visualize this data to make it effective, to be able to get back to telling that story that you're trying to convey. In some cases, you may want to have the raw data available for somebody to be able to get into and do some more analysis. The best way to do that is to put a drill down on one of your visualizations, or to provide a report that they can go to elsewhere to be able to get that. But the dashboard should be something that's very easy to look at, very easy to quickly grasp the meaning of. Speaking of the types of visualizations, Power BI in specific has a number of different types of visualizations available to us. And there's a few basic categories that most of them fit into. Trends. We're all familiar with trending type of graphs, so line graphs. Spark lines is a newer form of that, where you can actually put that on multiple rows, and you have lots of little tiny graphs. They can be very effective in certain circumstances. For comparisons, pie charts are the kind of the granddaddy that everybody knows. A lot of BI experts will or do not like pie charts. They're overused. They're often used badly. But they do definitely have their place. Just make sure that if you're using a pie chart that you use it appropriately. So make sure that you're not, one of the biggest concerns is skew. If you don't have data that adds up to 100% of something, the pie chart will make it be 100% of something, maybe not the thing that you intend it to be. So just make sure that you're dealing with like a percentage so that it's an accurate representation of whatever you're trying to show. Bar graphs are another good way to show comparisons, especially if you're not dealing with percentages, because then you show the relative weight between different types of data. KPIs get down to a single number, often and many times are represented with a traffic light type symbol or an up and down symbol. You don't want to have a huge number of KPIs because they get messy very quickly. But a few selected ones that just have a lot of punch are great ones to put in the dashboard. As far as tools to create your dashboard, the one that most people know about is Power BI. Very simple, very straightforward. It's a great end user tool. Even for those of us who don't do a lot with BI, it's very approachable. There's also versions that you can get for free if you're not intending to share your visualizations. If you do want to share your dashboard, you can get a Power BI Pro license for $10 a person. So it's not even all that expensive in the grand scheme of things. If you have Enterprise Edition for SQL Server, you can also get Power BI Report Server. And that's something that you install locally, but it has Power BI built into it, in addition to a standard reporting services server. And it can be a great way to get that in-house, especially if it's something that you don't want to put out on the web. And one of the weaknesses of Power BI is that the data refreshes with relative infrequency. So once an hour or once a day, or a manual refresh. If you want something that's more real-time, there are tools like that out there. One of those that's been adopted in a number of places in the SQL community is called Grafana. And this is actually designed to pick up that information as it's happening. It can be a great tool for something like if you're watching the number of connections and you want to see that scroll by in real time, you might want to use something like Grafana to be able to pick that up and see how that's changing moment to moment. Okay, oops. Get the right window here. So this is the very simple dashboard that I created for the demo. And you can see here several of the pieces of information that we've been talking about and that I showed you how I captured them going forward. So like the first piece of information is the number of days since the last reboot. Again, this is an example of a KPI. It's very simple information. I blew up the number to make it stand out and to really draw your attention to it. You could do this multiple ways as well. The number of login changes by the type. So how many logins have been created? How many logins have been dropped? For my visualization, I don't care what those logins are. I'm only looking for that pattern that would suggest that something is different, or that, hey, 5 logins were dropped yesterday and I didn't know anybody was going to do that. Why? What's going on? Another piece of information I grabbed for this was the number of connections by IP address. And this is a real-time, this is a little bit closer to a real-time graph than some of the rest of these might appear to be, in that I've got my hours across the bottom so I can see what happens in a given hour of the day, the number of connections that were attempted. And this is a little bit out of date because this is, a lot of this information this data was created for Summit. But here you can see you've got this outlier here. All of the rest of these have 192 addresses, which is my internal network. But there's this one on a 10 dot address. Oops, I moved it. There's one on a 10 dot address that really shouldn't be there. And you can very clearly see that it's down here. And I'm not the world's best person on visualizations, but so somebody could probably do this better. But the idea here is that you can see that, okay, we've got this 10.ip address. You click on that, and now it highlights that. So you can see that, oh, wait a minute. We had one connection attempted at 3 in the morning for that IP address that I don't recognize. What's going on with that? And it very quickly surfaces that one piece of information out of the thousands that are in this database to be able to allow you to spot that outlier. And that's what we're going for. We want to be able to tell that story. Certificate expiration, that's another one that I talked about, where how many do we have expiring that have expired or expiring very soon. So you can see how this is breaking it down and showing me, okay, how many are expiring within the next month, the next week, the next day. These all happen to, for the most part, to be system certificates, just because I wanted to have a good amount of data for the test. But you can see here how it makes it very obvious to see which ones are happening within the next hour or the next day or so, or have already passed, to be able to go out and take a look and see what's going on. If you wanted to create a new visualization, it is as simple as just selecting a visualization. So let's just, for argument's sake, let's just create a stacked bar chart here. And this is going to probably be a terrible example, but let's see. Let's go with these privileged role changes. And we're going to put in here the target role name. And we're going to make that the legend, let's say. No, that's not a great one. We'll say access, and I may have chosen the visualization badly, but we're going to select the summation of the row ID. So, but we don't want summation, we want count. So the number that were added to sysadmin, and oh look, there was one that was added to the sysadmin role during this last period when I'm tracking my information. If I had more than one database involved in this, or more than one instance, I could even use this slicers, what they call it up here. There'd be multiple listed, and you could just check which ones that you wanted to see. Power BI goes and dynamically filters everything. If I would go out here and I was to create login test password equal nothing, let's go out and create it. Test one. And now go back and refresh. It should only take a few seconds, and we should see now that this should jump from 2 to 3, and the additions to sysadmin jump from 1 to 2. Yeah, because Service Broker happens that quickly. And for whatever reason, it didn't capture that one quite the right way. It's probably a bug, but you get the idea. All of this transports the data around very quickly, and you'll be able to get information into your dashboard in a really good amount of time. Okay. So just a couple of final closing thoughts. There's many other things I could have done, some of which I've already mentioned, like live queries from Grafana. The data is going in real time. It's just not necessarily displaying or pulling out in real time or displaying it in real time, but you could do that. For something like the number of connections happening concurrently, you could use WMI. This is a great way to pull up performance metrics in particular, but also some of the other security metrics that are happening in real time, where you just want the number. WMI is what powers Performance Monitor, or PerfMon, that many of us know about. And it's always running, it's capturing a lot of different metrics about your servers, and you can, SQL Server, you can actually query WMI and pull that into the database. I mentioned that you can use a system stored procedure for capturing the last reboot time. When I built this for simplicity, and so I didn't include a lot like indexing and performance tuning in this, but you definitely want to do that in a real environment. And column store indexes can be a great thing to use for when you've got a large number of metrics like this. It can compress the data tremendously. Some cases, well more than 90%, and really reduce the impact that you have on your disk, because all these metrics can build up a lot over time. Because this is security data, you definitely want to make sure you're using the good data protection practices. So mask your data, use SSL, we talked about that earlier, use some sort of encryption or tokenization to protect that data at its source. For Service Broker, use Dialog Security, use Azure Key Vault to protect your certificates, and then get it off onto some sort of an isolated server, whether it's a Azure SQL virtual machine or just another server in your environment. Just get it off the production servers. Staying on top of your security is absolutely critical. We know this. A lot of us don't do it, though, because it's so hard to do it with tools that we have at hand. That leaves it up to us to create the ones that we need. Go out there and do some thinking. Identify some key metrics. Even if you're not visualizing them to start with, create some queries that you can run on a regular basis and just take a look at what's going on your server. Identify those metrics, tell the story, and in the end, create your dashboard and check it regularly, because no report, no log, no audit is worth much if you're not checking it on a regular basis. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I ran through a lot of information in the last 75 minutes.
I may or may not totally take your Service Broker stuff and use it for nefarious purposes.
Absolutely, please do. And if anybody has any questions about some of that, I know Service Broker isn't a widely adopted tool, even though it's been out for quite a while. Feel free to ping me. I'm happy to talk to you about it.
It's definitely a very, very powerful tool.
It is. It's intimidating when you first look at it, but once you get to know it and understand what the pieces are, it actually is fairly intuitive, and it once you set it up, it just works. So I really like it.
Hmm.
What other comments or questions do you guys have? You were very quiet. Is that normal for this group?
Yes, this group is a very quiet group.
My group too, so.
Right. I'm going to go ahead and kill the recordings in case anybody feels shy about that. So